Welcome to On the Soul's Terms podcast, a weaving of astrology, Greek mythology, and depth psychology. I'm Chris Skidmore, an astrologer, psychotherapist, and craniosacral therapist living in Ubud, Bali. Today we're joined again by Dr. David Russell. He was on the show last year, maybe the year before. It's really worth going back and listening to the episode that we did together a few years back. To tell you a little bit about David, or to give you a refresher, Dr. David Russell has a psychotherapy psychology practice in Darlinghurst in the Sydney CBD. In his therapeutic work, his intention is to attend to the experiential nature of desire and compulsion as experienced in everyday life. And David is a past president of the Sydney Jung Society and a past associate professor in the School of Psychology at Western Sydney University. It's a treat to sit down with David today and slow down a bit and let Psyche talk. And we explore Psyche through the story of Psyche and Eros. It's a story I also explored last year by just telling the story and going through a few pieces of it. It's fascinating to get David's unique and Jungian perspective. It's a most enjoyable conversation. I hope you enjoy it too. Welcome back to the show, David Russell. I really appreciate you coming back, a friend of the podcast in a way nowadays. So thanks for taking the time to come back on with me today.
My pleasure, Chris.
Yeah, obviously we've had a lot of conversations over the years, and you came on the show a couple of years ago now, wasn't it? It was a little while ago. We talked about your journey, and I recommend people going back and listening to that one. Fascinating episode, and your role in the Jung Society of Sydney and all these different things. But today we were thinking the story of Psyche and Eros, which I've also explored on the podcast just by really telling the story and going into it a little. And I would love to go into it with you. And obviously it has Psyche in it, it has Eros in it, it has all these characters. So yeah, where do you reckon, where should we go with it today?
Well, I'll take off and then you can help me along the way.
Love that. Yeah.
At any time, interrupt and amplify or whatever you like to do. So
lovely. Yeah.
Many of them in your hands. The particular take I want to present this evening is this story as a template for the key stuff that goes on in psychotherapy. Not all of it, obviously, but at the very heart of psychotherapy, I believe this story is of great assistance. Because the story has its origin, like all mythology. The characters come about because we humans need to create them. We incarnate the characters, the gods and goddesses, because they help us work with our struggle of human life. Mm. And thus, it's the same for psychotherapy. And so I'll begin with a little anecdote.
Please.
From way back in the history of psychoanalysis, actually. Sándor Ferenczi, a close colleague of Freud's in the early days, gave a startling suggestion that it wasn't free association that cured a neurosis. It was that the patient learned to free associate. In other words, learned to trust their imagination. So Freud was after the technique. I found something, it looks like it works, I'm going to virtually, make a dogma of it. But no, we've learned over the years that learning to free associate, learning to trust our imagination is at the heart of good psychotherapy for both the therapist and the client. And a little preamble before I get into the actual story to do with psychotherapy. It's, the young child, the baby, comes into the world like a desiring machine, full of desires, needs them to be gratified, satisfied, and has to learn that that's not going to be the case. Only sometimes will be satisfied. So there begins to be this split, and it's not necessarily a negative split, it's just an inevitable one between the inner world and the outer world. So the inner world becomes, for the child, right through to adolescence and adulthood, their world that they feel they've created and manage and is both troubling and joyful for them. The outer world has its own logic and rhythm, and they learn to cope. The split comes because some basic desires are not satisfied, or there's been shame of some sort. A kid's enthusiasm gets shamed. Of course, when there's abuse, the split is radical. Psychotherapy is about integrating the inner and the outer, so it works with the split. And the big love story of Eros and Psyche is about the split. Psyche is the human, female. Eros is the god. And no small matter when a god falls in love with a human. The condition of their maintaining this loving relationship was that Psyche was never to find out what made Eros tick. She wasn't to even try to understand, let alone explain his divine nature. And so they only met at night. They made love at night. But Psyche, being a human, had to have a look, had to try to understand as we do. We have this capacity that drives us to understand and wherever possible to explain. And that drive disrupted the beautiful love affair. Eros was driven or flew back to the divine realm, and Psyche was devastated. Such was her grief that she went down to the river to drown herself. And lo and behold, who should she encounter but Pan, the god Pan. Now, he's the most interesting, as you know, Chris, so well. Pan has got animal instincts, but not just animal, goat-like instincts, goat-like. Fancy how God with goat-like instincts. He was the one who said, no, Psyche, you don't have to go there. You don't have to kill yourself. There's a way through this. You'd need to go to Aphrodite and beg for her mercy, her forgiveness, her sense of justice. And of course, when she approached Aphrodite, she got this tyrannical talking to. She was made to feel less than nothing. And a bit about Aphrodite, very ancient goddess. Cyprus is usually the island of Aphrodite. And she was the goddess of the life cycle, certainly of love, as we know her today, but love and pain, pleasure, and the desire for ecstasy and the desire for agony. So this is, Aphrodite is not like the image we have her today. It's like the top of a chocolate box, arising out of the water, Botticelli, beautiful painting. Venus, Aphrodite, same goddess. No, Aphrodite was much bigger than that. And our ancestors incarnated her because they needed her. And they needed her in a way that they could personify, if you like, give homage to, ask for things, acknowledge her powers for changing the seasons and fruitful harvests. So it wasn't just that Psyche got to Aphrodite on a bad day. Aphrodite was furious that her son Eros should have fallen in love with a human being. So Aphrodite says, no way, you're finished. Get over it. Go kill yourself. Psyche begs, listen to me, give me a chance. Okay, Aphrodite finally says, I'll give you a challenge. Go into this room. There are thousands of seeds of all dimensions. Before the end of the day, before sunset, you need to have sorted all those seeds into appropriate piles of the same character. Psyche knew that was impossible. And so she falls into this state of deep hopelessness and helplessness. And the fascinating thing is it's only when she's in that state do the ants come and begin to do the work for her. So she lost that sense of confidence and agency that we cherish so much as humans. She was again ready to kill herself, but the ants did the job for her. She goes back to Aphrodite. She's amazed. Aphrodite is amazed. She says to Psyche, okay, an even harder task this time. And don't think you'll be able to do it, because you won't be able to do it. You have to go to the island where the golden fleeced rams are. These are not ordinary rams. These are killer rams. These are rams that when they see a human will tear the human apart. She has to get a bundle of golden fleece from these rams. And for you, Chris, in particular, you see the imagery from astrology here of all these figures outstanding, standing out. So again, she falls into a heap, back to the river to drown herself. And as she's about to drown herself, the reeds by the river whisper to her. So again, a very earthy symbol. We have the ants crawling along the ground. Now we have the reeds in the soil of the river speaking to her in a soft voice. Go, Psyche, go at night, and you'll find enough golden fleece on the thorny bushes. Make sure you don't stay there when the sun comes up, or you'll be dead. Psyche does that. She gets her bundle of golden fleece and brings it back. Now, just back to psychotherapy here for a moment. See, what is being driven home here to my mind is that we usually, both therapist and client, usually want to get an increase in understanding. Usually want to get some explanation for their split from the inner and the outer. But here we're being told in very dramatic terms that the only way there'll be integration of the inner and outer is if you abandon that need to understand and explain, open your heart, mind, if you like, to the mystery, but that can be a bit quaint, but to the imagination, to not trying to understand, to not trying to explain. So we've got to get into this hopeless, helpless state in order to give up our propensity to do that. And to my mind, this is the turning, the psychotherapeutic turning, if you like, is both client and therapist let go of the need to understand and explain and do the open-heartedness, open-mindedness, open-minded, open our mind to the unknown, open our heart to give and receiving of love. So anyway, Aphrodite gets the bundle of golden fleece. And the story doesn't end. Okay, Psyche, this time you need to go to the river of the underworld and take this goblet and fill it up with water from the river Styx and bring it back without spilling any. Psyche goes off to the underworld river, and when she reaches it, she sees she's the top of a sheer cliff. There's no way she's going to be able to climb down, certainly not get back up again. Holding the goblet in her hand, down comes an eagle, the eagle of Zeus, takes the goblet, goes down to the river, fills it up and brings it back. This reinforces this theme of letting go of the need to understand and explain. Psyche presents to Aphrodite the goblet of the water from the underworld, but still Aphrodite is not forgiving, is not satisfied, is not interested, is still treating Psyche as less than nothing, disparaging her vehemently, not giving her an inch. The next task, another impossible task, is to go into the underworld and meet the queen of the underworld, Persephone. And from the hand of Persephone, receive a jar of perfumed beauty cream, but not to open the lid. She doesn't know how in the world she's going to do this. She goes up into a tower to throw herself off the tower, and the tower begins to speak to her and says, there is a way of doing this, but you're going to have to say no on two very important occasions. On your way to get the jar of perfumed beauty cream, you'll come across a drowning man, literally drowning. He'll beg for your help, and you say, no, I cannot give you my help. And then you'll find three women who are weaving a carpet, and they'll say, come and join us, Psyche. And you'll say, no, under no account are you to touch the fabric. So down goes Psyche. From the hand of Persephone, the queen of the underworld, she gets the jar of perfumed beauty cream. Says no to the drowning man, says no to the three women, and as she comes up into the above world, being human, she can't resist but taking the top off the jar. And then the punishment, if you like, the retribution, is again on her head. she falls into a sleep, a never-ending sleep. Eros, though, in the divine realm, still has a love for Psyche. And so comes down and gives her a kiss on the lips. And she awakens. And then the divine and the human join in a good enough relationship and have a child, which they call joy. So the interesting thing, well, many interesting things here, but if psychotherapy has to do with inviting the divine into your life and somehow having an ongoing relationship, it's going to be based on the imaginative life. And if the task is to integrate the inner life and the outer life, there doesn't seem to be any other way of doing it. And this is what Freud's colleague, Shandor Frenzy, was saying. It's when the patient learned to free associate, when they learned to have an imaginative life, that integration began to take place. Over to you, Chris.
Yeah, well, thank you, David. Obviously, there's so many images to get into here. So, but yeah, just coming back to that statement that psychotherapy is about well, a few things that you're saying. It's about, one is about getting the imaginative life going, and another, well, another way to say that, I suppose, is to have a better relationship with the divine, or maybe just relationship with the divine. Because, I think about in this story, it's pretty tumultuous, the experience of coming into the divine, right? Like, it's a pretty tumultuous, dangerous place, actually. I think that's what is very, I enjoy it because it's realistic about right at the start of the story, Psyche is so beautiful that people stop going to Aphrodite's temples, right? So that's dangerous, so already she is, just by being alive in a way, just by her presence, she's in a dangerous situation. And then she's being confused for that divine. That sort of gets her into all this trouble in the first place, right? And that's what leads her to Eros in a way. And so I'm just sitting with how these two things, the imagination, free association, and I'm thinking about Freud trying to lock down a technique or technique, because he's just, I gather that he's trying to make it a legitimate science at this particular moment in time, but he's also stumbled upon free association, which is a very much non-rational, isn't it? I mean, you're saying, like, what does this image remind you of? And you're just kind of allowing yourself to go into, actually leave behind the rational mind by free association. And so it's an interesting kind of like, it's like the Eros Psyche split is almost there at the beginning phases of psychotherapy. Not that Freud necessarily is the beginning, but he's certainly a pinnacle figure in the formation of psychotherapy. So right there's the attentional point where the psyche itself is asking Freud to come out into the imagination. And maybe I hear some resistance of, well, would that be good enough as a technique? Could it be in scientific journals? Could it help us to have that other thing you're talking about, the understanding? So I guess the first theme that comes up, is not just in the story, but also in Freud's experiences early, is that understanding versus some kind of surrender. Yes. There's an understanding, going for the sun, going for the golden fleece ram, right? Like going on the solar journey of But she can't go there in the daytime. She can't go there when the sun is high in the sky. She needs to go later when the sun isn't so intense, which to me speaks to the rational mind is like laid off a little bit. And then it's not so dangerous to go and get these golden fleeces. So these are a few things that it's got me going in a few different directions.
Yeah, what you mentioned there about Psyche's beauty, it's emphasized, isn't it, in the first part of the story, how beautiful she was, how people paid her attention. And the subtext that I read is she loved it. She didn't mind them at all. In fact, she quite took on board this role of being an accomplished woman of the world and having people show respect, even adoration to her. All of that served her to zilch in terms of the work she had to do.
Yeah.
No one in the divine realm cared that she was beautiful. In fact, it was seen as a source of jealousy. So most of the versions of the myth, Aphrodite tended to be jealous. But Aphrodite, as I was saying earlier, we know her by the name or the Latin name Venus, but prior to that time, she was very much part of what our ancestors needed, and she had different names. And finally, the Greek culture settled on Aphrodite, that we have today. And Freud, Freud was so keen to move into, if you like, a male-oriented Eros position that Aphrodite doesn't get a mention. Yet in this story, she's the key player. She's the one who gives order to the whole universe. She's the one that has to be acknowledged and placated. And it's easy, as was the case with Freud, even though he did brilliant work. It's just so easy to go into the culture of the times and work towards achieving greater agency, greater competency. The way through your, what I call your split, can be accomplished with cognition and emotion and working hard to achieve that. What is missing totally is this, what you call this abandonment of that confidence we have in our privileged ability to call the shots, to use our willpower to make things happen. Not that trusting the ants or the wind, the speaking of the reeds or the power is an easy matter. It's not, as we so know. It's a discipline in itself, and we have to give over to it, I think. Not that the rational needs to be forgotten about, but it's so dominant in our culture, it's going to be there anyway. We're going to do our cognitive stuff anyway. But the psychological move seems to be this imaginative one, when the problem is not just something I possess, it's actually part of human nature.
Yeah, that's what makes me want to zero in on that second labor first, for whatever reason, because that feels like an interesting place. I haven't spent that much time in this labor in a way, but I get from what you're saying, I'm just hearing that, obviously the golden fleeced ram, that is the constellation of Aries. The golden fleece from the ram was the big Jason and the Argonauts massive adventure where they had to go and find that golden fleece that was hidden in a cave sacred to Eros or Mars, hidden by a dragon. So pretty classic heroic themes. So the fact that she has to gather up this fleece, the golden fleece, gather up some of it, is on the one hand saying she needs to be courageous, right? Like on the one hand, it's saying that she needs courage, but then not the kind of courage that's the midday sun, full solar heroic, as you say, mind over matter, cognitive rationalist hero that middle of this, because it's dangerous there. For some reason, it's dangerous there. You'll be devoured maybe by the heroic if you try to do this in the middle of the sun.
Go at night.
Go at night, yeah.
That's
so that's interesting. What's that about? Go at night instead.
Yes, well, it's indicative of that journey, the night journey, isn't it? Of, again, the imagery of the underworld and the logic of what goes on in the underworld is so different to the logic of the above world. And what makes you a hero in the above world totally lets you down in the below world. It's and that the same about the beauty cream. The perfumed beauty cream. It's like an anointing. The perfumed bit is anointing, and then beauty. Beauty is something, again, we recognize it in the upper world, but what is beauty in the night world? What is beauty in the underworld? We have to learn a different language and become fluent enough in it so that we can move more or less freely between the upper and the lower, between the inner life and the outer life. Not to disparage one or the other, but not to conflate them either.
Yeah, now that you say that, it's like at the beginning of the story, she's renowned for her beauty. And then at the end of the story, give or take, she needs to find the underworld beauty, which is an ointment or a cream, which is also sleep, right? Because if she opens that, she gets sleep. She goes to sleep. And, I feel like there's lots of exploration in that because, as you say, like even though she's replaced Aphrodite and she's probably pretty happy about that, she gets to be a little bit in that sunshine of everybody's bringing flowers to her and bringing ornaments and devoting themselves to her. But the thing that she doesn't have is relationship, right? Actually, in that, people just want to sort of pass by her and admire her, but they never want to actually, they never want to marry her in this story, right? So they never want her to become part of the everyday life. She's just in the other world. She becomes otherworldly and she's miserable, right? She's actually quite miserable. Like it sounded like a pretty good setup, pretty good thing. And then the whole journey kind of culminates in her going all the way down to Persephone, and it definitely will get back to the images of the drowning man. And I'd actually forgotten that element of the three fates or the three sisters weaving that she has to say no to. Very powerful there. But it ends up back at this underworld beauty, Persephone's beauty. And I guess that what is the relationship in a sense between Aphrodite and Persephone in this myth, or in this, it's more of a fairy tale, right? It's like the mythic figures are being used in fairy tale form. But what is that? Because this upper world beauty and this underworld beauty, and that they're sort of almost meeting here.
And yet we can't acquire them. I mean, taking the lid off the jar or opening the box, whatever the image is, she couldn't help herself because she was a human. She had to, let's assume, the impulse was so great to acquire part of the gift of the underworld or acquire some of Aphrodite's power. And she was doomed again. Every time she's on the cusp of feeling she's got it in the bag or life's under control, things are beginning to happen that suit her well, it all falls apart and totally falls apart.
Mm. Yeah, my memory is that she's trying to freshen up for meeting Eros again, so she just wants to take a little of that beauty.
That's right. Yes. And so human, isn't it?
So human.
What we can relate to these failures, this, as I said, on the cusp of integrating the inner and outer, and then we blow it.
Yeah.
Like totally. And we're back to the starting.
Well, we're kind of all ancestors of Pandora in that way, aren't we? In that origin myth, and we all have opened Pandora's box because we were told not to, or, Pholus the centaur is told, don't open the Dionysian wine. And, anytime you're told, like, don't, it's like the red button on the wall that says, don't press this button.
That's right.
It's like we don't even hear the don't, actually.
Or we do for a moment, but then secretly come back and give it a press.
It's like I gotta have some of that.
The drowning man, saying no to the drowning man really, to my mind, hits at the core of, but he's drowning. You can do something. You can help the drowning man. Just help him. No. And that's worth pondering on.
Yeah, it is.
Because no, again, to what is rational and looks right, feels good. No, a big N-O. And so for an old fairy story, each phrase, to my mind, is very clear. There's no imagery that is redundant. It's all just right. Mm.
Yeah, and I love about this story that it's embedded in what some consider the world's first novel, Apuleius and the Golden Ass.
It's a story in a story.
It's a story in a story, and it's told by an old lady to soothe a young woman.
Yes.
So it's very much in the realm of Psyche. It's very much like it's embedded, it's deep, it's inside a novel, it's embedded in there. It's kind of its own chapter of this book. It has nothing to do with the rest of the story, really.
No, nothing. Seemingly nothing.
Seemingly nothing, yeah. Until you really embrace it, yeah. So it's kind of its own sort of flow of words, isn't it? It's its own flow of expression.
And isn't it just the same with psychotherapy?
Yeah.
It sort of belongs and doesn't belong, this world we live in.
Yeah. Well, that's what I've appreciated working with you, David, because, where it's almost like, to the audience, I've actually worked with David for quite a few years. He's my supervisor and therapist, essentially. And what I love about our sessions is we'll be pondering something, and then it's almost like you get moved by the spirit, or something moves you, and you're just almost channeling in that place, and something's coming through you. And oftentimes it'll have a lot to do with, say, my own astrology chart, even though you don't know astrology. I found that quite early in our work, as like you were talking to elements of my chart without ever seeing or even knowing my chart, and I was like, oh, there's a different way in. There's a different way in that happens, and something, yeah. And something moves you. And I feel like that with this story, where something moved the author, Apuleius. He now inhabits the old woman who's now tasked with telling a fable or a little fairy story to this young girl who's in such distress, which in itself is a form of psychotherapy,
Indeed.
And I love Don't Save the Drowning Man. It's something that has come up a few times within my psychotherapeutic practice, actually, this little segment of the story, because, God, it's valuable. Like, I don't know exactly why and when, but when it is valuable, it's very valuable to know that, to know that in order for Psyche to to make it there and back, she has to do something that feels like it's very cold and very, that she's being selfish, or she's being discompassionate, if that's a word. She's not being very virtuous, is she? She's definitely not virtue signaling here.
And this is the thing of the underworld, what I call the logic of the underworld. The rhyme and the reasoning of the underworld is different to the rhyme and the reasoning of the above world. And that's quite a challenge to acknowledge and accept that. Because we want to understand in the same way as we understand the seasons above. We want to understand the workings of the inner life. And this story says, no, acknowledge them and accept them, but you're going to be defeated the moment you try to understand and explain them.
And does that lead us also into the three ladies who are obviously, I mean, when you have a bit of myth behind you, you kind of get the sense that they might be the fates. The three fates in Greek mythology are what is it, like weaving, measuring, and cutting of the length of string, basically, the length of yarn that is your life. And she's invited in, which is what an amazing opportunity for the ego to be involved in the fate.
Yes, exactly. Very tempting.
Oh, very exciting. Very exciting.
That's right.
I can weave my own fate, I can make my own thing happen.
I know, something special. I'll have something special I can give then.
Then I will be one of the fates. I'll be the fourth fate everybody was waiting for, and do that big heroic boost of then I'll be known Psyche, the fourth fate kind of thing. You can imagine this.
I mean,
this very enticing thing, and so she's given the wisdom. Don't accept that. That must be, we get a sense of, as you said before, it's the easiest thing to do because it's a 2-letter word and you just have to say it, no. But it's terrifyingly enticing and seductive, isn't it?
Yes.
And it's a bit of a hubris or something. It's like it's the confusion between the gods and the humans. It's a confusion zone.
And as we know from most of these mythological stories, when we confuse the two zones, we're in big trouble. There's always catastrophe at the end of that confusion. And so we need to incarnate, our ancestors did, and we do today, to create these god figures, goddess figures, in order to sit with them and learn from them. Now, the specificity of that is the open-ended, What is the specificity of that? How do we sit and learn alongside these key divine figures that we know our ancestors and we have incarnated, because we need them, because you can't have an imaginative life if there aren't images. We've got to embody the images. And that's a huge challenge for us, very rational beings. We can go into a spiritual, esoteric pathway, or a very scientific, rational pathway, both denying the open-heartedness of sitting with a divine figure that we've actually created ourselves. Divine, small d, divine. That seemed to be Carl Jung's mission. He knew that the traditional religions had their day, And he felt that his psychology could be a substitute, which is a big idea, that one. I don't think that's going to ever be the case. However, he worked at it. He worked hard at it, and that's to his credit. To my mind, it's for each of us to be our own creator of the imaginative life and to give it sufficient substance that, while on the one hand it's ephemeral, it's real, and we can take it seriously, but not literally. So this plays with our propensity to concretize, make things concrete, make things literal, want them to fit into a cause and effect sequence. But to my mind, this is the big story of mythology, which we both love so much. It's helping us on this journey.
Yeah, and it's also interesting, as you had talked about in last time you were with us here, about your history with Catholicism and your history with religion, which we share. Obviously, you have a much more in-depth history there, having gone, correct me if I'm wrong, but to the Vatican to study, right? Like you were deep in becoming a minister, or what were you becoming?
A monk.
A monk, yeah.
A monk.
You're
a monk in the
monk.
tradition of Saint Teresa of Avila, the Spanish mystics, John of the Cross.
Wow.
They're the works I studied.
They're the
primarily.
works I studied, yeah. And then
they had visions. Yeah.
So in some ways that was always in your thread. It's just that the place that you'd found before meeting on your track Hillman and Jung, or maybe Jung then Hillman, I don't know, but was that path, because religion was the container, for that in a way, and the mystic sex of the religion.
Yes. That's what fascinated me about the religion, was the mystical quality of some of the big people, the key players, like those couple of Spaniards and others. And it was for me then personally, I had to make that transition from a literal understanding of their writings to a mythic understanding, a metaphorical understanding. And that's been my personal life, since.
So, yeah, and that movement from the literal to the mythic, which kind of is part of this story in a way.
That's it, yeah, exactly.
As it moves in between, and itself being obviously full of rich symbolism. It's like a dream sequence that we're being presented with, and it's got the tasks, and it's got the human and the divine meeting or not meeting, somehow almost meeting. The challenges and the tasks that it takes to, and the torment in a way, right? Because Psyche is ultimately tormented and continually comes back to the suicidal, which in itself gets tragically literalized, because it's such a common internal experience, but it gets literalized in our age because we don't have the mythic imagination. So that becomes the literal thing, which is such a deep tragedy, I find,
And yes, it is a deep tragedy, and it's the same thing like the Virgin Mary. She becomes a holier than thou figure, and lost all her Aphrodite qualities. And there's a lovely painting somewhere in France, I think it is, of Mary slapping the bottom of the baby Jesus as hard as she can. And it just, presents that other side of that drama. But it's lost to us in our culture. We just get the sanctimonious, as I was saying, the chocolate box cover.
The literal virgin, yeah. Literal,
holy and pure, immaculate, impossible. It doesn't sustain us in our struggle of daily living.
Yeah.
We can aspire to do something better, but actually, this is the beauty of the Greek myths, is that they had the drama in there, the tragedy in there, that the failure, the human failure, part of the deal, constantly. No redemption, part of the deal, human failure. Yet the struggle goes on, and we can, like the child of Eros and Psyche, joy. We can be joyful in the midst of the struggle.
Is there a suggestion there that Mary and Jesus follow along the Aphrodite and Eros mother-son combination?
Sure. I think that was very clever of the Christians, and they built their churches. Like a lot of the Roman churches are built on the shrines
of Aphrodite.
Aphrodite, yes.
Yeah, well, because it is the lover, the ancient topic of the son lover, right? That kind of divine mother son lover combination of energies, isn't it?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Because Aphrodite has many children, but none quite as associated with her or linked to her or bonded to her in a way as Eros is.
Yeah.
And so if we come, this is fascinating. I've never sort of seen that as a cleaned up, like hopelessly cleaned up, because there's nothing virginal about Aphrodite. There's plenty virginal about Artemis and Athena and Hestia. There's virgin goddesses. That was clear for various reasons that they would need to be virginal, but to make an Aphrodite figure virginal is just like it just doesn't compute. It's like the mind hurts trying to put those two, because she's so relational. She is erotic.
So relational.
Yeah. So that just feels like such a strange hazing in a way.
We need her to be relational. That's why we created.
Of course.
Yeah.
And we create ones that aren't. Like Artemis is not relational because, she has to be about the hunt. And Athena is not relational because if you're all about strategic war, you can't be bogged down in relationship. And Hestia had such a strong, need to keep the fire going in the hearth that she couldn't be doing anything else, because if she missed a second of keeping the hearth going, we were all doomed, sort of thing. I'd love to come back into the story where, so we sort of explored a bit of the Drowning Man, that last part. We were in the Golden Ram, and we can get a sense of that. I want to repeat what I sense of that there's a courage that she needs, but it isn't a solar courage. It's more of a lunar courage. She has to show up, right? Like she has to continue to show up and be there. That's courageous in itself, but she doesn't have to like wear armor and grab a sword and put the helmet on and start to slay dragons and all that kind of stuff. That's not her style. And that's not the style of Psyche either, is it? Because that's how we get the massive hubris. Such a big confusion, that one, that it's up to me. And we're constantly sort of fed the image with all our superhero movies and such that we could be just as heroic.
Yes.
Which is okay on the one hand. Yeah, if I want to set out and, I don't know, win a Super Bowl, or if I want to do something that's clearly solar heroic, then great. But if I want to relate, and if I want to connect, and if I want to be in my life in a soulful way and make meaning of my existence and feel my life, then all of those things tend to do the opposite thing of numb me to the experience.
And that's where I liked James Hillman's image of the soul life being present in the Valley of Tears. In that the misty, moist valley where you can't see the path ahead of you. That's where one makes soul, not in the heroic quest. And I'm sure the imagery there that he was exploring was this, well, what do you trust? You know, when you're in the valley of tears, what do you open yourself to? And I feel confident to say, to the life of imagination. And we need to keep exploring what does that look like in our individual lives? So there's not just a mantra. How do we work with images from our dreams? How do we trust the flow of images that consciously we can follow? How do we learn to do that? So we need that. We need that sense of tangibility of imagery. That sort of, the imagery needs to be open-minded and sufficiently real that we can relate to it. That's a challenge.
Yeah, but it's fascinating, you know, how much when you do bring a story to life, like recently I've had the opportunity to bring stories to life with groups, and it's like people have it right there at the tip of their tongue. You know, it's interesting. You don't need to prod very much, because what happens through the story is that the psyche starts working, and then there's people who've got plenty to say, you know?
Yes.
It's not like people are at a loss.
Not just visual imagery. That's not what's intended here. It's imagery which encompasses touch and being touched, music, giving and receiving, dance, movement, giving and receiving. This is the world of the imagination. And to give over to it, to have a facility of giving over to it, not 100% all the time, impossible, but to have a facility of giving over to it, to allow that nourishment to come in. And then the outer life doesn't seem as foreign, or the inner life doesn't seem as foreign to us. You know, both seem to, I like them both. You know, we can work with those two modes.
And is that where the Grail image, because another element of the story that I haven't fully elaborated, or not that anything's fully elaborated, but that the Grail taken by Zeus's eagle into the river Styx to bring back the water of the dead ultimately. I mean, it's almost like there's too much there. There's so much to explore within that. So what's going on with the Grail? You know, I mean, this is a strong image that actually comes much after, because for the audience, you know, Puleus writes this in the 2nd century CE of the Common Era. So, you know, this is an old story. This is Holy Grail stuff, you know?
Yes, isn't it? And isn't that so with all these stories? There are earlier stories. There are stories that have to change according to the times, but the psychological theme remains the same. And it's a shame when the story becomes so rigid it's not allowed to be changed anymore. Because we need to have that freedom, to take the freedom to allow the imagery from a story like this one, Psyche and Eros, and just follow it, cognitively, consciously follow it, the image. Just let it take us somewhere, and all we have to do is follow it. And whatever we come up with is going to be of use to us. That's the big assumption. So we recreate, we reincarnate Aphrodite and Eros and Psyche continuously.
Yeah, something that Jason Holly, who's been on the podcast a few times, he talks about misremembering old stories. It's almost like knowing the stories well enough to misremember them so that they can become alive through the mistakes, right? Like very hermetic. And in those mistakes, there's a little crack in the old story, and you can follow that for a while. And, you know, which are now, again, the the mind that wants to lock all of this down is like, no, there's one story, there's one pure, true story, and we've got to make sure we get it exactly right. And I think the psyche is more keen to make the odd mistake here and there, and a little slip or a little hermetic moment where a different element can come in and liven up the whole thing all over again. But let's go into that grail then. So what is it? A grail with the water of the underworld river Styx, the sacred river that she's not allowed to spill any. You really heard it when you told it. She can't spill any of this water. This is really important to hold it within the grail. What's going on in this one?
That's the open-ended question, isn't it? What is going on there? Why do these specificity matter so much? Do they always do? And I think that underscores the underworld logic. Mm-hmm. It's not vague or waffly. It's quite specific, but it's different. It's so different. We've just got to accept that drinking from a chalice has always been an important ritual at times of birth, marriage, death. It's got that quality of being passed around and sharing of a community. And as the same with the perfumed ointment, it's like a holy oils being put on the baby's forehead of baptism or the dying person in the last rites. This anointing, it's ancient. It goes right back to our first. We needed to do it. Our ancestors needed to do these things, and we still, and of course we do. We still have to do them. We have to drink from the same chalice, and anoint each other with perfumed oils, because it's the touching and being touched. It's the love we give and receive, and it's the quality of that ongoingness that matters. It's not a static thing.
Yeah, and as you're talking, I'm thinking about the chalice as, chalice is literally the female version of phallus, yes. Chalice, so it is a womb. So we get the sense that in the third task, we're about to enter the underworld, but we're not there yet. And there's something about the containing within the womb space, which is where all of life comes from and goes back to, in a sense, that kind of imagery of making sure we've made some kind of contact with the underworld before we go there, and then the containing, like don't spill any, right? Like this is important now, stay steady, contain yourself within that. There's a lot of water, there's a lot of emotion, and we're entering into a phase here that's going to be pretty intense, but one needs to hold oneself and contain that much potency, because in the ancient times you would swear on the river Styx if you wanted to make a promise, or so we know that this is a sacred river. It's not just any river, and it leads to the underworld, and it's the main source of water to the underworld. So there's something about that dark, cool liquid, isn't it? It's like we're now interacting with, but not going there yet. We're making an interaction with, and that's why you bring up ritual. I when I was in the UK in the early 2000s, I made good friends with a woman named Diane and her daughter Lucy, and I was invited to Lucy's 16th birthday. She was a pagan. It was like a pagan family, and there was about 20 of us, and there was a ritual of her becoming 16, like a coming of age ritual, and it was like a death and renewal, and the grail was actually being passed around, just as you say. So she was in the middle we'd say a blessing. She'd take a sip from the cup. I'd take a sip from the cup, next person. And just the potency of the symbols and the ease at which everybody participated. And I felt very honored to just be in that circle and to be in this participation. And both mother and daughter were completely in tears, very, very moved by what was happening. And I remember Diane saying, this is it, that it's not going to be the same. Essentially, she doesn't have that daughter anymore. Her daughter has now died and been reborn as a woman, and she needs to take that seriously now. So their whole dynamic shifts. And, that always I'll always remember it, because it was like, that's the kind of thing that is so essential for the passages of our soulful lives. And as all those become, they get scratched from our everyday world, they get scratched from our culture, and it leaves a big opening, a big gap, I think, in the sense that we don't have that so common anymore.
We have to recreate, animate it. Yep.
Yeah. It's like, recreate somehow, remember, maybe dismember, remember. I'm not sure. And I guess the last thing I want to get to, and then I'll let you go because it's been so rich. And I know that's getting late there over in your part of the world, in New South Wales. Probably my most used part of this story is the seeds. It's something I often come back to because I feel within the psychotherapeutic framework, this separating out of the seeds is just so important. It reminds me of the process between Virgo and Pisces. Pisces can be the big chaotic mess of stuff, and Virgo sifts and sorts, and you've got these small creatures, the ants, that come along. So I wonder if we might speak to that and where those images take you, because I've always found that to be very rich as far as, when we're trying to make sense in a way that doesn't involve that sunlight, heroism, egoism. We make sense close to the ground.
I think that, the seeds, I believe, my assumption is they reflect the collective unconscious. And that's unconscious, so we're always on the cusp of knowing and not knowing. The seeds, to my mind, have that quality. And the ants, then, there's a movie that came out, 1984, an Australian Northern Territory Indigenous movie called Where the Green Ants Dream. Werner Herzog directed it. And so our Indigenous peoples had this green ant dreaming. There's, again, letting ourselves, with an open mind and an open heart, engage with this event, this phenomenon of seeds and what they hold, potentially, and the ants doing their thing, which we only can pretend to understand. Better not to try. I think the value of the unconscious is really important, because it sets the scene for what we can perceive and what we can't. We only can perceive so little. That's not only with our eyes, but with all our senses. Most of the other influences are outside of our awareness. They're unconscious. And then the collective unconscious is telling us, we're connected to the past and the future in, again, some manner which we can't understand. We can get a hint of, but it shapes our experiences day in and day out. Nighttime experiences, daytime experiences are shaped by these forces, unconscious forces, which we cannot get a handle on. And it's interesting now that neuroscience is just really acknowledging for really for the first time that this is how it is. That so much of what the experiences that shape who we are and our place in the world happen outside of our awareness, outside of our moment in history. That's I find that stunning, but totally believable, and just sort of, I think it's enabling, the fact that the neuroscientists, some of them anyway, are acknowledging this and putting it out there now gives me faith that science is looking at itself meaningfully and seeing what it's not seeing.
Yeah, I like that. I also think about that, and because you bring that up, it's like, I think I use it sometimes even in the craniosacral where some big event has happened and they've got seeds everywhere, right? Like it's just a, excuse my language, but a shitstorm. And, and the person is obviously using that front part of the mind or the brain to sift and sort, which means that they're not being like Psyche and understanding that that's not possible to sift and sort with that part of the brain. And then I think about the ants as those pathways right at the back of the brain, You can't control those, but they're trying to help you, just like the ants are these helpers. And if we just relax back, we give up on the task of that Psyche herself with her hands is going to be picking seed up, trying to figure out what it is, putting it in a pile, it's like the absurdity of that. And instead of that, the give up, and the give up gives it back to the unconscious. And it says like, well, I don't know how to do it, but I know it needs to be done. Because there's something of that, right? I don't know how to do it, but I know it needs to be done. And if the back part of my mind takes over, then it sort of gets done quite easily in the background.
Where the disposition comes in, we open our heart and our mind because we can't be passive. We just can't keep our fingers crossed, hoping that something good will happen. The disposition is terribly important. We need practice to open the chest, open the heart, to giving and receiving love without, payment, without consequences, and open our mind to the unknown. Because we don't have to be in control. We don't have to see our destiny. We don't have to be managing all the variables. Yeah.
Well, I love that. I love that final message. So I just want to say thank you. Is there anything else that pops in of this story and anything else around psychotherapy and the evolution of that? Is there anything that you would add?
No, I'm good. There's all sorts of things, but of course, we can't go on and on either.
We cannot. So this is a good set of hints and a set of nudges in the right direction, I think. If you'd like to hear that story more, you can go back and listen to last year. I think I told it in 2 parts, so you can go a bit more into the story itself. But this has been just a beautiful exploration. David, thank you so much for making the time and coming on the show for a second time a few years later. It's been a real pleasure.
A real pleasure indeed, Chris. Thank you very much.
Okay. Go well.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Thanks, David. Bye. Thank you for listening to On the Soul's Terms podcast. To support the show, please consider leaving a 5-star review, sharing with friends, or becoming a patron at patreon.com/onthesoulsterms. Until next time.